All right, welcome and thank you for joining us for the first lecture of three for this semester's series of lectures on the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States. It's hosted by Princeton University's Keller Center. We started this series in the spring of 2021 and are thrilled to be continuing it. I'm excited to tell you about this series first and then introduce you to our amazing speaker, Dr. LaTanya White. My name is Isan Beezer. I'm a University Administrative Fellow hosted by the Keller Center and a PhD candidate at Rutgers Business School, where I study entrepreneurship from both contemporary and historical perspectives. The center's mission is to arm our community with the intellectual foundation, innovation skills, and networks to propel positive and sustainable societal impact. As a center, we recognize the pervasive and systemic racial inequity in our country and how this deeply is linked to many of our country's most profound challenges. We understand how important it is that our community has an understanding of these systemic inequities as we work on solving some of humanity's most pressing challenges. And that brings me to this series of lectures. For all interested in innovation and entrepreneurship, much can be learned from the entrepreneurs who have succeeded under some of the most daunting constraints. For at the end of the day, isn't that what entrepreneurship is all about? It's about assembling limited resources for impact. Black innovators and entrepreneurs have overcome restrictive markets, segregation, Jim Crow laws, lack of access to capital, even threats of violence and death, theft of intellectual capital, and many other extreme challenges. Yet still they thrived. These entrepreneurs have created innovations that have resulted in lasting societal and cultural changes far beyond the Black community. By exploring the history of Black entrepreneurship and innovation, we want to learn from the creative strategies Black entrepreneurs employ to succeed. At the same time, we want to explore how the constraints on Black entrepreneurship and business development have limited the overall economics, not only of Black communities, but our society as a whole, and how so many of these constraints, which have become institutionalized, can be overcome in the future. This exciting series of talks brings together scholars and academics from numerous institutions from across the country to share their scholarship in a discussion-based forum. The title of Dr. White's talk for today is Building Black Dynasties: Genealogy, Succession Planning, and Wealth Transfer in Black Business Families. But before I hand the room to today's scholar and introduce Dr. White, during the talk, please put your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. Okay, not in the chat if you can avoid it. So Q&A, we need your questions. We want your questions. Dr. White really welcomes your questions. And we'll have time at the end, and I'll make sure that Dr. White answers your questions. So Dr. LaTanya White is the recipient of the North Star and Innovation New Scholar Awards for Entrepreneurship Education and Research. She's an expert in belonging, racial equity, and entrepreneurship. As a result of her leadership, impact, and contributions to the education and business administrative sectors, Dr. White was recognized by the U.S. Department of State as a Fulbright specialist. She leverages her research and expertise on Black entrepreneurship and the racial wealth gap to help inclusive entrepreneur support organizations to create racial equity in their policies, praxis, and programming. Dr. White is a two-time author, TEDx speaker, and the founder of Concept Creative Group, a professional and management development training firm focusing on empowering Black entrepreneurs, their families, and their communities. Now, without further ado, I will pass it on to you, Dr. White. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isan, and thank you certainly to the whole Princeton family and to the Keller Center for Entrepreneurship. I am super excited to be here, and I am going to try to stick to the time limit because, as you might imagine, I can literally talk about this all day. So for those that I have not had the pleasure of meeting before, thank you all for joining. You see me here pictured with some of the members of the dynasty that I'm building. As Isan shared, an award-winning entrepreneurship educator, Fulbright specialist, racial equity expert, TEDx speaker, but I think most importantly, I was rushing through to get to this part on Mom to Sparrow. So on this picture, you'll see my daughter Sparrow, my mom, and my sister. So I look forward to sharing how Dynastic Wealth benefits all four or all three of them in different ways and in a different context than what we understand generational wealth to do. So with that being said, I want to make sure, just kind of leveraging that experience that I had. I taught entrepreneurship for 11 years at a historically Black college in Florida. So we always want to start with our learning objectives. I want to make sure that everyone is situated. You know what we're doing and what our roadmap is today. So we're going to start a bit with the historical backdrop and how we got here, and then moving into this billionaire bonanza and the racial wealth gap that characterizes where we are, before finally getting into what building Black dynasties really consist of and what lies ahead. So this particular image you see is from United for a Fair Economy, and it shows the boosts and blocks to building wealth across the timeline of American history. I want to We naturally don't have time to go through all of this, but I want to bring your attention to the experiences of different ethnic groups and those barriers to building wealth within those communities and those groups. What we're going to focus on today is the Black entrepreneurial experience. So I'd like to start our discussion with something that occurred in 1896. So this does not take away from the impact of chattel slavery in America, but to really be able to make a more direct correlation between our the historical context and the lived experience of Black and Brown founders today, we can make a direct correlation between these lower levels of social capital, entrepreneurial self-efficacy, and entrepreneurial execution through a lot of the milestones in history and in academia. So looking at Plessy versus Ferguson, this landmark ruling that legalized racial segregation and how it has impacted these lower levels of social capital. We know now in our discussions about fundraising and venture and exits and unicorns that a lot of how we get to becoming a unicorn or a billion-dollar business was based on who you knew and who could advocate for you. So we look at the impact of legalized racial segregation, which made it illegal for me to be in the same physical space as my majority counterparts. We can see how that carries through to those lower and diminished rates of social capital. And social capital we'll unpack a bit more, but that's the value, for lack of a better term, of our relationships and our network. So pressing forward, in 1940, M.S. Stewart, who is a white male economist, began studying the insurance industry and really looked at how do Black-owned insurance firms, how do they fare as far as revenue and income compared to white-owned insurance firms? And what he found was that because of legal racial segregation, Black insurance owners actually were relegated to having almost solely only Black consumers or customers. Now, how this impacts the success of those businesses, we have to remember the time that we were in. So Black families were locked out of the labor market. If they were employed, they were underemployed. If they did own a home, then that home was in a red line area whose appreciation grew up to 10 times slower than other homes in non-red line areas. So this means that these Black consumers typically had much less discretionary income. So how does that impact the insurance owner? That means the policy, the face value of the policy was much lower, and thus the revenue of that Black-owned insurance firm was much lower compared to their white counterparts. Unfortunately, this is a pattern that we still see today. Fairley and Robb actually have indicated that in most examples, in most industries, a Black-owned firm is generating 3 times, or rather 1/3, the amount of their white counterparts. And there are certainly systemic factors that contribute to that. So from this theory of economic detours, which basically said because of legalized racial segregation, Black-owned businesses typically had almost solely Black customers who were making less money and therefore had less discretionary income. Around the time of the late 1980s, there was a lot of research around what was happening in what are called ethnic enclave economies. So I grew up in Miami, Florida, and there are a lot of studies that look at the business and entrepreneurship history of Cuban Americans in Miami, Florida. And around that time, there was a lot of discussion and excitement about what happens for a community, what happens for a group when they live in the same areas, they have their businesses in the same areas, and so they live, work, shop, and play with each other. That data showed that those Cuban Americans experience high levels of economic mobility. And so the question then became, well, if this group of ethnic minorities can lift themselves up by their bootstraps, why aren't Black entrepreneurs and why aren't Black businesses, why aren't Black families able to do the same thing? In 1991, John Sibley Butler basically answered that question. And in his reconstructed theory of the ethnic enclave economy, he situated the fact that those ethnic minorities had not experienced structural racism. They were not the product of chattel slavery. They were not navigating through post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic slave syndrome, rather. And so his short answer is, but there were no bootstraps. Black entrepreneurs had no bootstraps to pull themselves up by. He was really attempting to level the playing field in a discussion about what it takes for an ethnic minority group to experience economic mobility. From there, in 2004, the question then became, well, where can Black entrepreneurs experience economic mobility? What is the space that they should be operating in to experience that? And Adia Harvey actually discovered that for at least for Black women in the late, or rather in the early 2000s, the hair and beauty industry was that field where they could do well, where they were able to experience economic mobility for themselves and for their families. She extended that research to really unpack the intersectionality of being a Black woman. And she developed the theory of the racial enclave economy. So that theory basically says that it's not just because of racism that Black women can experience social and economic mobility in this specific area, or the same for Asian women or African American men, but it's due to both racism and sexism. So on the chart here that you see on the screen, and this is from 2008, this is based on the research from 2008, Harvey Wingfield found that, and these look very stereotypical, right? I remember serving as a certified business analyst with the Small Business Development Center, and 99% of my clients or the students that I would mentor and coach, they all would fall into these categories. And at the time, I did not understand why it almost felt like that was a natural reflex. Well, I want to be an entrepreneur. I'm an African-American woman. I'm going to open a hair salon. Or I'm a Black man and I'm going to open a barbershop. And Keith, Dr. Hollingsworth, we've talked a little bit about what those two industries have meant for economic mobility. But if we really unpack the root cause of that, it was a lot of, as a result of racism and sexism that relegated these ethnic minorities into the same types of businesses historically. Now, the Census Bureau's American Business Survey is sharing some insight on how the business sectors, or which business sectors ethnic minorities are moving into. And so we're getting away from the more labor-intensive lifestyle businesses as a whole, but we know, and I'm preaching to the choir, that African-American entrepreneurs, Hispanic entrepreneurs, and Asian American entrepreneurs, we still are very heavily underrepresented in the high growth high profit, tech-enabled, scalable industries. So from here, one concept that emerged in my research was this idea of legacy motivation. In Black communities, Black and Brown communities, there is so much excitement about building legacies, establishing generational wealth. And what I like to be able to share is what that looks like academically. So in 2015, a group of scholars actually studied legacy motivation among Korean Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. Their study found that African American business owners had the highest rates of legacy motivation, meaning they had the highest rates of the intent to pass down their family businesses. We'll get into talking a little bit about this concept of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations and how structural racism has really impacted the starting from scratch that Black entrepreneurs and African-American business families have faced over the course of history. So I want that to really settle in on these high levels of legacy motivation. From there, though, what was found was while Black business owners had the highest levels of intent to pass down their businesses, they were among the lowest to execute in passing down their businesses. And a part of that comes from the lived experience of the children of those founders. There are anecdotal studies, anecdotal research that shows that the second generation, those children, they saw their parents work so hard and not get as far as they thought that the children did not want to take on the same lived experience. And so that had a lot to do with why the businesses were not passed down. So as we really situate, especially in today's era, the focus towards innovation and technology, especially in light of the SBA's $3 million bucket of money that they're giving to improve participation in the innovation economy. A lot of that means that those businesses need to be tech enabled. But the traditional characteristics of the types of businesses that Black, Hispanic American and Asian American entrepreneurs were starting are labor intensive. They were heavily dependent on the founder to be there and physically deliver the product and service. So how do we make these types of businesses, which we still, as a whole, participate in heavily, how do we make these businesses scalable? How do we make them investable? And this is where the opportunity to connect the historical legacy of Black entrepreneurship with the future of work and bring those two things together. And some of the scaling solutions rely on technology, but some of these I'm just not sure that we want, Chat GPT to produce for us. So those I left blank, but I'd love to hear your comments in the chat. What are your thoughts about how we drive African American and minority-owned businesses forward through technology and still carry forth the legacy and the history that they were built upon? From there, what I came across was this report so the Institute for Policy Studies every year issues a report titled Billionaire Bonanza. And in 2018, the theme of that study was inherited wealth dynasties. So I went down the rabbit hole, as you typically do as a social science researcher. And what I found through several references that are listed here at the bottom is that a family will reach dynastic status based on 2 to 3 conditions. So either the family has controlled the business for 3 consecutive generations, the wealth from that first generation entrepreneur founder has been maintained and controlled for 3 consecutive generations, or that both conditions have met. So we're focusing almost specifically on these 3 consecutive generations. In our discussions and our excitement about generational wealth, we're looking at almost solely one form of wealth to the next. So the next single generation. So this is one of the major characteristics behind or between generational wealth and dynastic wealth. And we'll talk more about what those other distinctions are. So these were the conditions that I searched for, that I used in my search for finding Black dynasties. One other characteristic is that dynastic families had a sense of identity that said they were building businesses with the intent to create a dynasty. So the foresight that they had in their entrepreneurial operation was so much different from what Black entrepreneurs had in a lot of cases because of the cost of being Black in America. It is hard enough, right? So we are in survival mode a lot of the time that you don't even have the bandwidth or the capacity to think 3 generations from now. And anecdotal conversations with Black entrepreneurs, a lot of the times it's hard enough to process, what am I going to be doing in 3 weeks, let alone 3 generations? But dynastic families were not concerned only with building generational wealth. They were focused on building dynasties in those 3 consecutive generations. So in my search for Black dynasties, I did some reverse engineering. I did some deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and still the sample size was so small that I was not able to conduct my research on Black dynasties. So I had come across, and I was writing my dissertation during the pandemic, post George Floyd, after the murder of George Floyd. And for many entrepreneurs, you were probably spending a lot of time on Clubhouse, and like I was at the time. And I came across the founder of the Raising Black Millionaires company and her set of flashcards. I went through these flashcards. I checked the Black Enterprise Top 100 list. So I started at what are the Black-owned companies that are thriving, and that there's public information about them that's easily accessible. Between Black Enterprise and the Raising Black Millionaires flashcards, I thought, well, this is a good place to start to find Black dynasties. And then I went to Dr. Juliet Walker's Encyclopedia of African American History to see if I could trace back the genealogy of those businesses. Between Black Enterprise's multi-year list of top 100 Black-owned businesses and this list of businesses from the Raising Black Millionaires flashcards, there were almost no businesses that had been documented in the Encyclopedia of African American Business History. Dr. Walker actually takes us through the historical and biographical landscape of African American business predating slavery through 1996. And there were almost no businesses that still had a public-facing image. North Carolina Mutual Insurance, very, very prominent Black-owned insurance firm, did not meet the conditions. It had not been, at least through publicly available information, it was no way to determine that they had been owned and kept within the family for 3 consecutive generations. So, starting from the list of current Black businesses and walking backwards through the Encyclopedia of African American Business History, I found myself doing a Google search. Who is the current owner of? Is XYZ business still around? Even down to Black businesses with 3rd generation ownership. Now, I'm happy to say there are a lot of Black-owned businesses that are on the cusp of dynastic status. And again, this is in the public eye. This is public facing. So there are certainly, I'm sure, plenty of Black business families that have maintained control of their businesses for 3 generations but we don't have access to their stories. We don't know their lived experiences. We don't even know who they are. So I do have a call to action for you at the end of of our time together. So I see there's a raised hand, Isan. Okay.
No.
Okay. So let's see. There's a question in the Q&A that I think we'll get to as, as we continue with our discussion. So some of those Black dynasties that I did find, they were in different industries, and a part of really pursuing the research method that I use, which was phenomenology. That is the study of the lived experience of a group of people going through the same phenomenon. And in that case, I wanted to be able to find an industry that represented these Black-owned businesses that were either dynastic or on the cusp of dynastic status. And again, there were so few of those businesses that I had to change my research question and really explore Black founders, first generation Black founders who had the intent to build a dynasty. But I do want to amplify some of the Black businesses that are still creating impact. I don't have the names here because I want you to really begin to know these logos and these icons and these brands, just like we know Ford, we know McDonald's, we know Walmart. Those are dynastic families. Those are dynastic brands. And we have the opportunity to amplify Black dynasties as well. So the H.J. Russell Company, so for any Atlantans in the audience, I'm sure that you're familiar with the Russell family, their impact in civil rights and construction and real estate, and now, even more importantly, almost closing the loop on their impact in Black communities, the Russell Center for Entrepreneurship. The Russell family is currently in its third generation of control, so they have certainly met at least one condition for dynastic status. I have here the image of the book written by Madam C.J. Walker's fourth great granddaughter. So Madam C.J. Walker, the Madam C.J. Walker Company did reach dynastic status at the time of the research that I conducted, that the brand had been controlled for 4 generations in the family before being divested. And then we have the McKissick family that's in their 5th generation of control and currently run and operated by Cheryl McKissick, who is the 5th generation female that is managing the business. So these are 3, and I do want to make a point about Madam C.J. Walker. So the company had gone through the 4th generation, then was divested, and more recently has been repurchased by Sundial Products. So now you'll start to see Madam C.J. Walker products back on the shelves. So these are just a few samples. Again, the ones that were public facing, the ones that we had access to their stories and are able to amplify and bring to the fore. So how do dynastic families really transfer wealth? And the main aspect of how that's done is through this identity that they possess of being generative. So generativity is the characteristic of paying something forward. Like you see yourself as doing the work or being of service, especially if you're an educator, to create better outcomes for the future. And in that identity construction of building a dynasty, that is the narrative, that's the script, that's the story that you tell yourself. That is what drives your decision-making through your day-to-day operations in the business. So one of the things I shared earlier, one major distinction between generational wealth and dynastic wealth. There's no way that a family a Black family can survive structural racism, Jim Crow, redlining, microaggressions. There's no way a Black business can survive 5 generations just by turning over the business. There are these other forms of transfer of wealth that have to take place. And in fact, as I was conducting my research with first generation Black founders who had this intent to start a dynasty, 7 out of 10 of them would say, well, my aunt had this, or my grandfather did that, or my mom had this business. And although they had not inherited any wealth assets to start their business, they truly identified as first generation because they were starting from scratch. There was no mentorship. There was no one in their families that they could lean on to learn business acumen. And so that's a major distinction between wealth transfer from a generational wealth perspective versus dynastic wealth, and specifically in business families. So 3 generations of control, 3 consecutive generations of control, 4 directions of wealth transfer. So I started our talk today with a photo of me, my daughter, my mom, and my sister. In dynastic wealth transfer, wealth is transferred in 4 different directions. It's not transferred from me down. It's not just transferred from me down. I'm able to transfer it across as well to my sister, to my cousins, and then also up to my mom and my aunts and uncles, and even to my grandmother. And so that wealth is not just financial. There are these 4 other forms of wealth that dynastic families cultivate and that they're very intentional about passing down. And so just quickly, we'll define each of those. This financial wealth, these are the business assets, and it really is dependent on the foundational and brand identity of the business, pricing, profitability, strategy, operations. Like, these things don't just happen. It takes us a high level of intentionality in the succession planning process. From financial wealth, which is the foundation of the dynasty, there is this idea of spiritual wealth. And where spiritual wealth is not based on any specific religion, it requires that there is an established family identity, that there are family values that everyone ascribes to. And then there is a vision for wealth. There is some research that talks about dynastic families in some of their plans for future generations. They want to ensure that those future generations experience freedom from wealth. And that is a concept that is completely unheard of to me, but the basis of having a freedom from wealth means that the individual's identity is not encompassed in this family's identity as being dynastic. So really creating the space for future generations to walk into their own, to establish themselves as philanthropic leaders or business leaders, but without being entitled to what may come, or the privilege that comes from being in a dynastic family. So that vision for wealth is really, what are those economic and future benefits that we want to create today? How do we want to ensure that generations we may never meet will be sustained, and that they'll have the opportunity to create more businesses if they so desire? And then, of course, there is the family's estate plan. From spiritual wealth, looking at the wealth of knowledge. And this is recording and valuing, amplifying the lived experience of people in the family, regardless of their entrepreneurial status. So recording the wealth of knowledge really brings forth family history and, again, that lived experience. But even more importantly, the passions, skills, and abilities of other family members, So now we see all of the pieces on the chessboard. We know how to make strategic investments into intellectual wealth. So based on what people are already good at and how that fits into the vision of wealth, based on their lived experience and how those lessons and those failures can create a shorter path to success. We invest in intellectual wealth to ensure that other members of the family can reach self-mastery and self-actualize. That return on investment comes back to the family, if not the business, either quantitatively as a financial return on investment or qualitatively. And typically through relational wealth. And again, let's think about social capital. It's the strength of the relationships that we have, both within our families, within our businesses, and in our communities. And in order to transfer social wealth, or rather relational wealth, what we're actually transferring is social capital. We're making sure that there is entrepreneurial exposure, which lends itself to entrepreneurial persistence. And research shows that higher levels of entrepreneurial persistence, that's the tendency to stay in business, is often a direct correlation to the levels of entrepreneurial exposure. So these families, think about the fifth generation owner of the McKissick family, certainly having been pre-exposed to entrepreneurship, and that lends itself to the perpetuation of the dynasty and that transfer of wealth. There's also leadership development that takes place within the family and an introduction to service and philanthropy within the family. So the H.J. Russell Company, they have their platform Russell Cares. And this is where you can apply for grants or sponsorships. This is their community outreach and engagement arm. These things don't just happen. They are very, very intentional, and they have to take place in a space that is psychologically safe. Because again, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge what it costs to be Black in America, what the investment is to start a business as a Black person in America, historically, and as we experience it today. So one of the ways that Black families have done this historically, and dynastic families have transferred this knowledge and have been intentional about this transfer, is really through attending their family retreats, where every generation, just thinking about that picture that I started with, all four of us, there are three generations in that photo, but each generation is a part of the transfer of wealth in each of these areas. So my daughter, Sparrow, she would be exposed to relational wealth, entrepreneurial exposure, leadership development, service and philanthropy. My generation, my sister and I, my cousins, we're looking at the family estate plan. What's the value of the family's estate plan? What did we lose this year? What did we learn? Where will we invest next year? And then my mom and her siblings are looking at, are we being true to our family identity and our family values, our vision for wealth? My grandmother is still very young and very spry. We see her on Zoom 2 times a week. And so she literally gets to enjoy the fruits of her labor as she encourages us and stays with us. So even though my grandmother had not started a business, our family is still building a dynasty. There are 3 generations of us involved. There are 4 different directions of wealth transfer, and we are actively pursuing the development of 5 different forms of wealth. So that call to action for you is to really recall and build on the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in America and package your own family's spiritual wealth. Surely there was someone that inspired you in your family that had a side hustle, or they had a business, or that maybe they are full-time entrepreneurs now. And it's the opportunity now to capture that spiritual wealth. Protect your family's wealth of knowledge, but also share it. We need your stories. The Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, they have a consortium for students that attend HBCUs where a Black museum is housed on their campus. Those students, those museum professionals, those cultural heritage preservationists need your stories. 3 generations from now, we don't want to be having the same conversation about not being able to find Black dynasties in our research and in the public facing media. So this is our call to action today to truly honor, as we kind of close out Black History Month, to truly honor the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in America. And then, of course, all of that brings us to providing and creating dynastic wealth for future generations. So we've got the first 3 generations covered. Now the next generation is their responsibility to pass it forward, just like our ancestors have done for us. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Please connect with me on social media. Looking forward to answering questions now out of respect for everybody's time, because I can talk about this all day. So turning it over to you, Isan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was an important and amazing talk. Your work is really fascinating and clearly impactful. So we have some wonderful, you're welcome. We have some questions for you. The first one would be related to business models. So what can owners do or teach their children and partners to, I guess, the business models use to help the transfer of wealth and to build this dynastic wealth? And the person mentioned, franchising, networking, affiliate marketing. Anything on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really that first form of wealth through financial wealth, and it is the business itself. So business models are so much more straightforward than the traditional business plan. But let's not forget the value of experiential learning. As a business owner, as you are going through the day-to-day steps to identify your customer segments and communicate your value proposition, all those building blocks from the business model canvas, there's no reason why your nieces and nephews, your godchildren, your sisters and brothers, there's no reason why they can't be, if they're interested, why they can't be involved in doing those things and carrying out those activities on a regular basis. But certainly different ways to build entrepreneurial wealth, real estate investing, starting a business or buying a business. And then other forms of wealth building opportunities may come through stocks, real estate investment trust. Let's see, there's so many opportunities today, but I think the bottom line is to ensure that anyone in the family who's interested in learning has the opportunity to do so in a way that speaks to them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And so we have another question from the audience. Thank you. Keep the questions coming. These are great. We have a wonderful scholar here, so please take advantage of her being here live with us. The question is, can you talk about how your work has been going with the families interested in this work?
Oh, yeah. So I actually done this work with my own family, and I love them to death. And we put the fun in dysfunctional, but I did get the opportunity to kind of test everything out over the course of 2.5 years with my own family. So we went, in my family, we went from having about 30% of us not having a vision for wealth to having the first draft of our estate plan, having the first draft of our family constitution. But other families that I've worked with are also in the same process. They've discussed, where do we want to put our money? What do we want to invest in? But they hadn't really established who are we as a family. So one of the things that I'm looking forward to doing this year is really scaling the impact around helping Black families really to build their own dynasties. And so We'll be testing that out this Juneteenth weekend in the DC metro area for the inaugural Dynastic Wealth Family Retreat. Well, we'll have genealogy specialists, we'll have estate planners, and we'll even be hearing from members of Black business dynasties to really walk through what it looks like. What is the actual work, the pen to paper work that's required to build a dynasty in real time? So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. So we have another one. I love it. Keep them coming. Can you talk about the pathways for Black entrepreneurs in this era? Is there a network where groups of African Americans can come together to generate ideas or find Black businesses to invest in?
This is such a timely question. The Minority Business Development Agency was established in the early 1960s, but the agency had to be renewed under every administration. The Biden-Harris administration actually codified the MBDA. So it's a permanent agency, and it's actually the only federal agency that is focused on serving the need or meeting the needs of minority business enterprises, different from the Small Business Administration. So just kind of going off on a tangent here, make sure that you know your industry code, your North American Industry Classification Code. So as a consultant, my industry code, I'm eligible to be a small business as long as my revenues do not reach more than $16 million in a year. So while as a solo founder, I feel like a small business, I am like microscopic in the context of the SBA. The MBDA, on the other hand, they are focused on the needs of socially and economically disadvantaged individuals who have entrepreneurial pursuits. Make sure wherever you are in the world, or at least in the country, make sure that you're connected to either a small business development center, a minority business development business center, there's also the Enterprising Women of Color. Make sure that you're finding the business support organizations or entrepreneur support organizations. These companies, these organizations are preparing to apply for $93 million from the Minority Business Development Agency. There are 3 program pillars under the Capital Readiness Program, and one of them is access to networks. So these entrepreneur support organizations who are pursuing up to $3 million over the course of 4 years are going to be evaluated on how well they create networks for socially and economically disadvantaged or SETI entrepreneurs. So they are being paid to create networks for you to build community, build mentor relationships and peer support groups in order so that your business can thrive, scale, and ultimately become dynastic.
LaTanya, Dr. White, I want to step in here for a moment because you know that, and you know this because you've worked at an HBCU like me. I think this is an area where we're missing out on. And I've pushed this at Morehouse for years and I can't get traction on it. But as much as we have homecoming, we should have an event where Black entrepreneurs can come back and meet each other. I mean, again, you know this as I do at an HBCU, homecoming is a major networking event.
It is.
But to come out and maybe meet a day earlier and allow people who are looking for franchise, you know, the number of Black franchisees in this country is the same percentage now as it was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. So if we could create a fair where, you know, these companies that want Black franchisees can meet the people who are trying to invest. There's a lot of things out there. Minor League Baseball met with us at one time because they wanted to get more Black investment into minor league baseball. And so it is pulling these groups together. And it seems like I wish HBCUs would take a little bit more lead on this. And because I think there's a space here that we're not taking advantage of. And it doesn't have to be HBCUs. I'm just more familiar with those. But I think there is an opening here to try to help people network better and to pass information along and to just find other contacts on this business to business.
Right. I
And it's
completely agree.
yeah.
Thank you for that, Keith. So there's another call to action for our enterprising creatives out there. There surely is an unmet need to create something of that nature, and there's money to get it going. So we'll hopefully, when we're having the Spring 24 series, someone will jump in and say, "Well, I remember Dr. Hollingsworth said." But yes.
Okay.
Is
Is there another
Great.
question,
Thank you.
Easton?
Yes, absolutely. We have a lot of them. So
okay.
this is wonderful. So you spoke of a family constitution. What does that consist of, and how does it factor into dynastic wealth?
Oh, so the family constitution, just like how we understand the US Constitution, is really, it provides the governance. And it says this is how this family trust will operate. And the family trust is that legal vehicle that protects the assets of the family. So two books that really helped: Entrusted by David York and Complete Family Wealth by Jay Hughes. Those two books were the first resources that I were interested. It was like I'm today years old learning about a family constitution. And while it was very rich information, I did not see myself as a Black founder in what they were doing. So a part of the work that I did in helping to construct a family constitution was I really made sure that in my family, as we were having these discussions, I made sure that I did my own healing, because again, I would be remiss if I did not consider the pain and the trauma and the vestiges of pain that come from being Black in America. And so going into a discussion with family to talk about two things that we don't talk about, money and death, right? There is inner work that has to be done. So before entering into the work to build a governance document that says these people are eligible or these descendants are eligible to be heirs or beneficiaries of the family trust, this is how the assets of the family trust are to be used. That's what the family constitution is. It gives you the governing laws that your family generations from now will adhere to in passing down that wealth, and it articulates your vision for wealth. So in the work that my family and I did to really kind of build out our family constitution, we had some really intense discussions about, well, what will the money be for? What will it be used for generations down the line? These are people we will never meet, right? We don't know what the state of the economy will be at that time. So we took a historical perspective and we looked at, well, what do we know to be true about economic mobility? We know that there are certain things that over the course of time have impacted a person's financial status. That is ownership of real estate and or land. That is business ownership or control. Also, of course, there is stocks and options. And then there's also, you'll see that there's a relationship between some of the wealthiest families and some of the highest levels of philanthropy. So the four conditions that our family agreed on in the draft of our family constitution, these are the four things that this money or these assets can be used for. So one of the things that's not included is paying for medical bills or burial expenses. And so, of course, that brings up another question. But one of my uncles suggested that in each of our own personal estate planning documents, our own wills and power of attorneys, and our own individual trusts, that in our life insurance policies, and he shared this for consideration, that we make our family trust a beneficiary of our life insurance policies. So that way, no matter when there's a draw or distribution from the trust assets at the time of someone's death, those things are recompensated if they hadn't already been done so. So dynastic wealth is this really comprehensive approach to how we prepare the next generation, plural, for success. It's not just, well, let's make sure they go to the right college, because when you read Dorothy Brown's The Whiteness of Wealth, we have to take into consideration that we should be in a home, right? Or we should be in an area zoned for the best and most well-resourced schools leading up to college so that they're ready for college. So it's not just those things that we can see in the immediate future, it's how do we prepare for the future based on this historical data that we have.
Wow. So thank you. And I want to repeat the two books you mentioned, because there's a question about a template for family constitution. And I think you mentioned Entrusted and Complete Family Wealth. So that's, I want to repeat those resources for everyone. We have two related questions, but it's more about next steps for people, regular folks, like, where can they find some information to continue to learn about this dynastic wealth and how to start it?
So I think, I know I'm working with Florida A&M University in their Blackstone Launchpad program. So Blackstone Launchpad at FAMU have committed to advancing racial equity and entrepreneurship, and they host, we partner together to deliver a 7-week training session titled Building Black Dynasties. Let's see, famu.startuptree.co. I can type that in the chat. That's where anyone can get access to the information and to the training. But with a lot of the organizations that I work with, we're always centering and amplifying racial equity, wealth equality, and specifically in the context of dynastic wealth. So wherever you see me on social media, I'm usually talking about dynastic wealth and building Black dynasties and the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship. So I'm Meet Dr. White on all socials.
So quick, one sort of last question for you. So Keller Center, for example, is working on innovation and design, entrepreneurship, trying to increase minority participation. What kind of advice do you give people now that are trying to do this? And so I do teach this, Black entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And you're right. There's these certain industries that Du Bois said really came from the plantation. Mm-hmm. The barber, the tailor, the lunchroom. I mean, they were, but they're still in effect. Yep. 150 years later, they're still in effect. And so I don't know, but is it teaching people that even if you go in these industries, if you do it right, you can do generational wealth? Or is it looking for other industries? Or what sort of advice do you give to us now, to young Black entrepreneurs, to say, hey, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't say young, it doesn't matter, to newly starting Black entrepreneurs?
It's a matter of, we talk a lot about meeting people where they belong. The assumption there is that you know where they feel like they belong. So I have a colleague, so glad to see him in the audience, that conducted this research. Dr. Mark Brown conducted this research on the concept of monocopsis, and that's the lack of the feeling of belonging. So a part of that, the continuum of the entrepreneurial journey is, while Black founders are getting all the technical assistance they can handle from SBDCs and business centers and colleges and chambers of commerce, the opportunity is, when do we begin talking about the entrepreneurial mindset? When do we ensure and engage with people who aspire to be entrepreneurs and say, no, you belong in this space, you're well equipped to be successful here, and really increase their levels of self-efficacy, which is the idea that I can do a thing. So starting with this work and the entrepreneurial self-efficacy and the mindset before getting into technical assistance really can turn a lot of the work that we're doing. We can see so many better outcomes if we begin to look at the entrepreneur as a whole person and really respect their lived experience. What did they come to the classroom? What did they come to that first meeting with their coach? What did they bring into that experience with you or with me? And being able to honor that lived experience and how we help them to build, grow, and scale their businesses. And then, of course, we're going to be having this conversation 60 years from now, unless we are teaching Black founders how to strategically transfer wealth so that 3 generations from now, or 60 years from now, no one is feeling like they're starting from scratch all over again.
And I do think, we've done this at Morehouse and talked about it other places. I do think there needs to be a particular look at a Black entrepreneurial mindset. It's just not the same thing. There is a different lived experience. There's different cultural factors, and there's different challenges and fears. And if you don't take that into account, and there's probably some with others, but I particularly know that one. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Isan, I guess you're going to close us out.
Yes, sir. So yes, I reiterate, thank you again, Dr. White, for this amazing experience that you're giving us. It's more than a talk. You are amazing. Thank you, Keller Center and Princeton University, for continuing to enthusiastically support and host this lecture series. Each semester, we have 3 lectures and a concluding roundtable. So 2 more lectures remain. So please keep an eye out for the next announcement. Register and attend live so your questions can be answered and your comments addressed. Finally, I would like to remind you that all talks are recorded, so they can be found on the Keller Center website. So please watch and share. We need this to be spread everywhere. So on your socials, email, however you spread things to people that you care about and think that's maybe interesting, please do so. And again, thank you. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Learn more about the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States by visiting kellercenter.princeton.edu/Black entrepreneurship. Join us for future Keller Center events, which you can find at kellercenter.princeton.edu/events.